Thank you, Madam Chairman and members. Like my colleague, I find it hugely ironic that in the week when we finally saw off the Mayor of London's proposal to concrete over the Hoo Peninsula, that we are here this evening talking about proposals to concrete over the Hoo Peninsula. The Council's position on Lodge Hill is in marked contrast to the position which we took on the airport, though the arguments are essentially the same: the need to protect our communities, our environment, and the wildlife which relies on it. It is quite frankly hypocritical to say on the one hand that Boris Island was bad, while undermining that argument by saying that Lodge Hill is good. Now, while I appreciate the pressures on ward members elsewhere, particularly the leader and deputy leader of the council in other parts of Medway, which are facing development, most notably Capstone Valley, all we are asking for this evening is that residents on the Hoo Peninsula are treated fairly and equitably, which many feel they are not, and I agree with them. Now, members will have already seen the very comprehensive responses which have been submitted from residents, environmental organisations and parish councils. I would refer members to the very detailed response which was submitted most recently by Hoo Parish Council, who I'm glad to see are with us this evening. Now, for the purpose of brevity, I do not propose to go through the OPA line by line, and will instead focus on some of the more salient issues. In my opinion, it is quite clear that there are a number of inaccuracies and flaws in the arguments which are being made in favour of Lodge Hill development. There does appear to have been some very selective cherry-picking in terms of quoting favourable sections of the NPPF, while ignoring the more substantive sections which do not favour this development whatsoever. In terms of the environmental impact, Lodge Hill is the only site of special scientific interest notified specifically for nightingales, and is estimated to hold more than 1% of the national population, particularly important given the fact that nightingale numbers have suffered a huge decline in recent years. The proposed development would destroy the majority of nightingale habitat and constitute one of the largest ever losses of a SSSI to development. Like my colleague Councillor Watson, I believe this would set an extremely dangerous precedent which would leave every SSSI vulnerable to development. Further, it is not clear where the nightingale compensation land is proposed in Shoebury Ness or Foulness is to be located. The rationale behind the NCL site selection criteria is vague, and there are uncertainties relating to environmental data as noted by Natural England and the RSPB. In terms of the National Planning Policy Framework, Medway Council eventually withdrew its core strategy on the basis of the inspector's findings in relation to the Lodge Hill allocation and its failure to meet national planning policy. If allowed to proceed, the development would set a deeply damaging precedent, not only through the loss of the only designated site for nightingales in the UK, but also by seriously undermining the NPPF. In my opinion, this would be a monstrous act of environmental vandalism. In terms of the NPPF, the inspector for Medway's core strategy hearing concluded on the evidence presented that not only was the proportion of PDL on the site likely to be closer to 15% than 50%, but also that because the site is of high environmental value and the presumption in favour of development normally given to brownfield land doesn't apply. Now, it is quite clear to anyone who's ever visited Lodge Hill that this site is not a brownfield site, and it should not be regarded as such. Now, one of the major tenets of the NPPF is to safeguard our rural environment from urban sprawl and encroachment. Lodge Hill, if built, would lead to the eventual merger of Wainscott, Chattendene, Hoo and High Halstow, and if that isn't urban sprawl, well, I don't know what is. On the issue of infrastructure, it is clear that we are some way from having an acceptable proposal to cope with the increased traffic and pressures on local services such as health, water, school places, which Lodge Hill would present. Now, we only need to look at the current pressure on the staff and services at Medway Hospital. It would be sheer madness to allow another 5,000 dwellings to be built without addressing such issues first. And in terms of traffic, anyone who's tried driving through Strood recently is only too aware of the inadequacies of the current road infrastructure. And I fear that without substantial work in terms of redesigning our roads in and around Strood, most particularly around the Sands Perel and the Four Elms roundabouts, residents and businesses across Rochester and Strood will face permanent gridlock should Lodge Hill be approved. The issue of access and egress to and from the site is also hugely concerning in terms of the impact which this will have, not just for the residents of Lodge Hill if it is built, but for everyone who lives and works on the Hoop Peninsula, which effectively has one road on and one road off. That's it. This clearly hasn't been sufficiently thought through, and the statement on page 151 that the proposals incorporated in the replacement transport assessment are not fully supported and something more appropriate would need to be agreed at a later stage is quite frankly concerning, as is the statement on page 152 concerning the wider area that the modelling results submitted by the applicant for the Sands Perel and Anthony's Ways roundabouts can only be considered in fairly broad terms since they are based on assumptions that cannot be fully secured at this stage. This is simply not acceptable. Now, I hope that all members will vote freely as their conscience dictates based on the facts before them and the substantial weight of opposition and arguments against this proposal. Quite frankly, this is no time for political games this evening. It is much more important than that. The decision which you make this evening will have a huge impact not just on the environment and residents of the Hoop Peninsula for many years to come, but on the whole of Medway. And wouldn't it be far better to secure this site as a green space for future generations to enjoy, and maybe perhaps consider making effective use of the pocket of suitable land on the site by building perhaps a new hospital for Medway, which is desperately needed. Now, to finish, let's be clear on one thing. Approving this development would not just be a case of simply rubber stamping a planning application or an outline planning application. If this application is approved this evening, it would be a death sentence for our environment, our villages and our communities in rural Medway. And I urge you to reject this application. Thank you.